first one came down out of the orange sky and split a man in half on the boardwalk, and Evan Hark thought, very clearly, this is what the end of a species looks like. He had been holding a paper cup of bad coffee. He was still holding it. The cup was warm against his palm, and that small ordinary heat was the only thing in the world that still made sense. The thing on the boardwalk was not a bird. The news feeds would call them sea eagles for the first 6 hours, because that was the closest word humans had, and humans always reached for the closest word when the true one would break them. The thing was the size of a small aircraft, with a beak like a turned blade and feathers that were not feathers at all but flat polished scales, arranged in the pattern of feathers, the way someone might draw a feather from memory if they had only ever heard one described. Its eye was a wet black coin. There were filaments along the inner edge of its wing that pulsed in a slow rhythm Evan recognized, after a long second, as a heartbeat that did not match its own. It looked at him. Across 30 meters of cracked planking and the smell of fried dough and seawater, the thing looked at him, and Evan understood, in the cold animal part of himself that did not need language, that he was being measured. Not hunted. Measured. Then it lifted off the corpse with a small wet snap and flew inland, low and unhurried, and the screaming started. His coffee was still warm. His name was Evan Hark, and he was 34 years old, and he repaired marine diesel engines for the small commercial boats that worked out of the Santa Cruz harbor. He had calloused hands and a slight stoop from leaning into engine wells, and a habit, learned from his mother, of humming an old Portuguese fishing song under his breath when he was concentrating. He was not a soldier. He was not anything. He was a man who knew how to make broken things turn over again, and in the weeks that came he would learn that this was, against all reasonable expectation, exactly the right thing to be. The girl he loved was named Kim Aoyama, and she was a marine biologist at the Long Marine Lab up on the cliffs, and at the moment the first sea eagle came down on the boardwalk, she was standing in waist-deep water in a wetsuit too, miles north, holding a sampling probe and arguing with her advisor about pH levels. She would not learn that the world had ended until she walked up the beach 40 minutes later and found her car on fire and a young man she had never met dying quietly in the dunes with a hole through his chest, the exact diameter of a closed fist. They had been dating for 11 weeks. He had told her he loved her, on a Tuesday in a parking lot. Badly, the way men do, when the words have been crowding their teeth for too long. She had laughed and said only love. And he had said no, I mean the real one. And she had kissed him and said good, because the other kind was for people with time. Neither of them had known, then, that they did not have time. They had 4 days before the sea eagles came down in a wave that turned the coast from San Francisco to Monterey into a charnel house. And in those 4 days the world did what the world does when something impossible begins. It explained. The networks ran experts. The experts ran out of words. The second day, the experts had stopped saying eagles altogether, and were using phrases like aerial bioform and exo-coordinated swarm, and finally on the third day, a woman from a defense lab in Maryland used the word arrival on a live broadcast, and then put her hand over her mouth as if she had said something obscene, because they had not come from the sky in the way meteors came. They had come from the sea. Trawlers in the deep Pacific had reported them surfacing in clouds, thousands at a time, rising from water that had no business holding anything that could fly. The drone footage, when it was finally released, showed something the human nervous system refused at first to parse: an ocean boiling upward into wings. A geneticist on a podcast Evan listened to while he worked said the simplest sentence and the truest one. She said, "These things are not from here, and we have been very stupid not to notice." She said it in a tired voice, like a mother who had warned her children and been ignored, and 3 hours later her broadcast went dark and never came back. On the fourth day, the sea eagles attacked Santa Cruz in earnest. Evan was in the harbor when it began. He was on the deck of a 38-foot fishing boat called the Maria Luz, elbow deep in a fuel pump, with the owner, an old Azorean man named Tio Rui, who had been calling him Filio since he was 17, sitting on an upturned bucket, smoking and complaining about the price of bait. The first sign was the gulls. Every gull in the harbor went up at once, in a single white panic, and then a shadow passed over the water, and then another. And then the sky was full of them. There were hundreds. They came in a long curving line, low over the masts, and the sound was not the sound of birds. Shh. It was the sound of a man's shop running at full pitch, a grinding metallic chorus that he could feel in the fillings of his back teeth. Tio Rui crossed himself slowly, the way a man does when he has decided to die well. Evan reached into the toolbox and took out the largest wrench he could find. What followed was not a battle. There is no word for what followed. It was a harvesting. He watched a sea eagle drop onto the deck of the boat next to the Maria Luz and pick up a deckhand named Carlos, boy of 19, the way a hawk picks up a fish. He watched Carlos kick once and then go limp. He watched the thing carry the boy up into the orange afternoon and out over the breakwater, and drop him from a great height into the surf, and then circle back and pick up another. They were not eating, they were not nesting, they were clearing the boats. Tio Rui pulled him into the cabin and slammed the hatch, and they crouched there together, listening to the world end. And Tio Rui, been at sea for 51 years, and had survived 2 storms that had killed every other man on his crew, a small medallion of Santo Antonio from his neck and pressed it into Evan's hand and said, "In Portuguese, you keep this, Filio. I am too old to run." Evan said, "You are coming with me." Tio, Rui said, "The engine in this boat is older than your father. It will not start cold." "You know it will not start cold," Evan said. "It will start for me," and it did. He had rebuilt that engine twice. He knew its moods the way a man knows the moods of a difficult wife. He coaxed it over while the hatch above them rattled with the impact of bodies, and he got the Maria Luz out of the slip and into the channel, with the wrench still in his belt, and Tio Rui pressed flat against the cabin wall with his eyes closed and his lips moving. They did not go out to sea. The sea, Evan understood now, was where these things had come from. He turned the Maria Luz inland, up the San Lorenzo River, as far as her keel would carry her, and ran her aground on a mud bank under the cover of the bridge. And they crawled out of the cabin into the brown water, and up onto the bank, and into the willows, and lay there for a long time, listening to the screaming from the boardwalk, and the strange grinding song of the things in the sky. He found Kim that night. She had walked from the marine lab on the cliff, down through the burning neighborhoods, 3 roadblocks that no longer had anyone manning them, through a stand of eucalyptus, where a sea eagle had pinned a man to a tree with its beak and left him there like a butcher's hook. She had walked the whole way with a steel sampling rod in her hand and a wet towel over her hair, because she had figured out, with the cold practical part of her marine biologist's mind, that the things hunted by movement and by heat signature, and that a wet cloth confused them, briefly. She had figured this out alone, on a hillside, while watching one of them miss its strike on a deer in the grass below her. When she came down the riverbank in the dark and saw him sitting there with his back against a willow root, she did not run to him. She walked. She sat down beside him in the mud and put the steel rod across her knees and said, "Are you hurt?" He said, "No." She said, "Good." He said, "Are you?" She said, "No." He said, "Good." And that was all for a long time, and it was enough. There were 9 of them by the end of the first week. There was Evan, and there was Kim, and there was Tio Rui, who would not leave Evan's side, and who had appointed himself, with the silent gravity of old men, the cook and the keeper of the small fire they did not always dare to light. There was a woman named Detective Marisol Vega, who had been off duty when the attack came and who had walked her own daughter's body out of a burning house and laid it in a flower bed, and then put her service weapon back in its holster and gone looking for survivors. There was a teenage boy named Caesar, who did not speak for the first 4 days but who could climb anything. There was a veterinarian named Anna, with a broken wrist she had set herself. There was a man who would only give his name as Lou, who had been a Marine in another century, and who carried a hunting rifle and 3 boxes of shells, and a quiet, terrible competence that everyone recognized and no one mentioned. There was a girl of about 8 named Ruthie, whose parents were gone, and who attached herself to Kim with the silent permanence of a barnacle. And there was a man named Father Dom, a Catholic priest of about 60, who had walked out of his church carrying a chalice and a 5-gallon can of consecrated communion wine, because, he said, if the world was ending, he would prefer to be drunk while it happened. And also it was rude to leave the wine. They sheltered in the cold, dim cellar, of an old winery in the hills above Soquel, and they listened to the radio, and they listened to the sky, and they learned the rules of this new world the way children learn the rules of a cruel game. Rule 1. The sea eagles did not hunt at random. They hunted in patterns. Detective Vega worked it out, sitting on an overturned wine barrel with a notepad. They swept in arcs. They cleared territory grid by grid. They were doing reconnaissance, and then they were doing extraction. Someone, or something, was directing them. Rule 2. They were not invulnerable. Lou put down 3 of them on the first night with the hunting rifle, 2 through the eye, and 1 through what Anna, the vet, after some examination of the corpse, identified as a thin, chitinous panel under the throat where the breathing organs concentrated. They were difficult to kill, but they were killable. 3. The one that mattered most, and the one Kim figured out at the end of the first week, hunched over the dead one, Lou had dragged into the winery for her to examine. They were not finished. There were still more in the water, many more. The wave that had hit Santa Cruz was a scout wave. The main body was still somewhere out in the deep Pacific, waiting. For what? She did not know. She knew this. She could hear them. She had brought her hydrophone from the lab, a small underwater microphone she used to listen to whales. She had dragged it on its long cable down to the creek at the bottom of the winery's vineyard, and dropped it in the water. And she had listened, with her headphones on and her eyes closed, and she had heard them. A grinding metallic chorus, very faint, very far away. The same song the things made in flight. They were singing to each other under the sea. Coordinating, counting, she told Evan, late that night, sitting on the wine barrel with the headphones around her neck. She said, "They're going to come ashore. All of them." He said, "When?" She said, "Soon. Days. Maybe a week," he said, "and then," she said, "and then there will not be anyone left on this coast." He looked at her for a long time. He looked at her face, which was thinner than it had been 11 weeks ago, when she had laughed at him in a parking lot. He looked at her hair, which was uncut now, and tied back with a piece of electrical wire. He looked at her hands, had a small, fresh burn across the knuckles from the morning's cooking fire, and a chemical stain along the thumb from the work she had been doing on the corpse, and he thought, "I am going to marry this woman, if either of us lives." He said, "Can you tell me where they are?" She said, "What?" he said with the hydrophone. "Can you tell me where the main body is? Direction, distance." She thought about it. She said, 2 hydrophones I could triangulate. With 3, I could pin it within a kilometer. "Why?" he said. "Because I am thinking about something stupid." She said, "Tell me." He said, "The Maria Luz is still on the mud bank. Her engine works. Her hold can carry 800 gallons of diesel. Is a fuel depot at the harbor that is not burned. There is a small commercial fishing boat in the slip next to hers, the Anna Ruth, that I serviced in March, and her engine works too. There are tanks of compressed acetylene in the welding shop at the boatyard. There is a great deal of ammonium nitrate fertilizer in the agricultural co-op down the road, because this is California and people grow strawberries. If a man knew where these things were gathered, in the deep water, and if a man could get a boat near them with enough of the right cargo, a man could make a very large hole in the water. She looked at him. She said, "You are not a soldier, Evan." He said, "No, I am a diesel mechanic. I know what burns, and I know what doesn't, and I know how to make an engine run with a target on its back. That is exactly the right amount of soldier for this." She said, "You would die," he said. "Probably." She said, "I am not asking you to die," he said. "You are not asking. I am offering." There is a difference. She did not pause for a long time. She took the headphones off her neck and set them down on the wine barrel between them. She put her hand over his hand. She said, "Then we will need a 3rd hydrophone." He said, "We." She said, "Do not be stupid. You cannot navigate to a sound. I can navigate to a sound. You drive the boat. I find the place," he said, "Kim." She said, "This is not a discussion, Evan Hark. I love you. And the other kind of love is for people with time, and we do not have time. So we will go together, or I will go alone. And you can stay here and explain to Ruthie why her second mother did not come back." He said, "All right." She said, "All right." They were quiet for a while. The cellar was cool and smelled of old oak and turned earth. Somewhere above them, Father Dom was singing softly, drunk, in Latin one. He said, "I have a question." She said, "Yes." He said, "Tio Rui has a medallion. It was his wife's. He gave it to me on the boat. I think it should be yours," she said. "Why?" He said, because if we live, I would like to be married to you. And I do not have a ring, she said, Evan. He said, I know it is a bad time, she said. No, yes, give it to me. He took the small worn medallion of Santo Antonio from around his neck and put it around hers, and she pressed it flat against her sternum with her palm. And she did not cry because there was no time for crying. Her eyes were very bright in the candle's light, and she said, All right, Evan Hark. All right. The next morning they began to build the boat. Took them 4 days, and it took every member of the small group, and it took 2 trips to the harbor, through territory the Sea Eagles patrolled, in slow circles, and on the second trip Caesar, the boy who could climb anything, caught, in the open behind the fuel depot, and dropped from a height of perhaps 200 feet onto the asphalt of the parking lot, and they buried what was left of him under a lemon tree in the winery's garden. And Father Dom said the words over him and did not drink, because, he said, the boy deserved sobriety, and Father Dom did not always feel he himself deserved it. But they got the diesel, they got the acetylene, they got 900 pounds of ammonium nitrate, and Lou, who had been an engineer in another life before he had been a Marine, sat in the winery's barrel room and mixed it with diesel oil in old wine barrels, with the slow patience of a man rolling cigarettes. They got the Maria Luz off the mudbank at high tide, with Tio Rui at the wheel weeping and laughing, and they brought her up the coast, hugging the rocks, to a small hidden cove they had scouted, and there they loaded her, in 3 nights of brutal work, everything they had assembled. She was a bomb. She was a 38-foot fishing boat that had survived 51 years of weather and 1 alien apocalypse, and now she was a bomb. And Evan stood on her deck on the 4th night and ran his hand along her cabin frame and apologized to her, quietly in the way a man apologizes to a horse he is about to put down. Tio Rui stood beside him and did not speak. After a while, Tio Rui said, She is happy, Fio. A boat dies happy when she dies useful. Evan said, I am sorry, Tio. Tio Rui said, Do not be sorry. Bring her home if you can. If you cannot, tell her she was a good boat when you let her go. He said, I will tell her. Tio Rui said, and tell her I sent you, so she does what you say. They left on the 5th night at moonset. It was Evan and it was Kim and it was Lou, because Lou had said very quietly that no one was steering a floating bomb into a swarm without him on it, and there had been no arguing with him. Detective Vega had wanted to come too, and they had told her no, because someone with a gun and a brain had to stay with Ruthie and with Tio Rui and Father Dom, and Detective Vega had cursed them, quietly. And then she had hugged Kim for a long time and said, You bring her back. Both of you bring each other back. Kim said, I will try. Detective Vega said, Try is not the word is do. Kim said, All right, do. They went out into the dark Pacific, with the running lights off, and the engine throttled low, and the hydrophones trailing astern on their long cables. And Kim sat in the wheelhouse with the headphones on and her eyes closed, and she navigated them by a song no human had been meant to hear. The water was very flat. The stars were very bright. The world above the water was beautiful in a way that made Evan want to weep, because he understood that he was probably going to die in it, and that he had not, in his 34 years, looked at it nearly enough. Lou, sitting on the deck with the rifle across his knees, hummed under his breath. After a while, Evan recognized it. It was an old song. His mother had sung it, a Portuguese fishing song. He did not ask Lou where he had learned it. Some things in the last hours of a world did not require explanation. Kim said in a low voice from the wheelhouse, 12 kilometers, bearing 270. They are very loud now, he said. How many, she said. I cannot count them. The signal is saturated. Thousands, Evan. Tens of thousands. They are stacked in the water column from the surface down to perhaps 400 meters. They are doing something. They are arranging themselves. For what? She said, I do not know, but it sounds like a countdown. He said, how long? She said, hours. 6, maybe less. He said, then we go faster. He pushed the throttle up. The Maria Luz, fat with diesel and ammonium nitrate and acetylene and her own old patient soul, groaned and gave him another 2 knots. The wake behind her was very white in the dark. At 9 kilometers, Kim came out of the wheelhouse and stood beside him at the rail. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, Evan. He said, yes. She said, when we are close enough, I want you to put me and Lou in the skiff and turn loose the lines and go on alone. He said, no. She said, listen to me, he said. No, Kim, listen to me. We agreed. She said we agreed I would find the place. I have found the place. You do not need me on this boat for the last mile. You need me alive to tell the others what we did. You need Lou alive to keep me alive on the way back. You will run her in alone, on autopilot if you can, and you will jump off before she goes. And we will pick you up in the skiff. That is the agreement now. He said, that is not the agreement. She said, that is the new agreement, he said. I do not accept it. She said, you will accept it, Evan Hark, because the other version is the version where I watch you die for nothing. And I am telling you with my whole heart that I will not survive that, and you owe me. You owe me my survival. I gave it to you. Give it back. He looked at her in the starlight. He looked at her for a long time. He said, I will jump. She said, swear it. He said, I swear it. She said, on what? He said, on the medallion. She put her hand to her throat where the small worn disc rested under her shirt. And she nodded, and she kissed him, once, in the way of people who have run out of time, for long kisses. She said, all right then. He said, all right. 3 kilometers they slowed and put the skiff over the side, and Kim and Lou climbed down into it. Lou shook Evan's hand. Lou said, you set the autopilot for 270 true. You wedge the throttle full forward. You do not stop to look at anything beautiful. You go over the stern at 1 kilometer out. You swim east. We will find you. Do you hear me? Evan said. I hear you. Lou said, say it back. Evan said it back. Lou nodded. Kim did not say anything. She put her hand against his cheek for one moment, and then she sat down in the skiff and took the oars, and the small craft slid away into the dark. And Evan was alone on the Maria Luz, with her humming engine and her belly full of fire. He wedged the throttle. He set the autopilot. He went down into the cabin, one last time, and looked at the gauges and the wiring, and the old cracked photograph of Tio Rui's wife, that was still taped to the bulkhead above the radio, and he said quietly, in Portuguese, you were a good boat, Maria Luz. You were a good boat, and I am sorry. Tio Rui sent me, and you will do what I say. He went back up on deck. He did not look behind him. He did not look for the skiff. He looked forward, into the dark, where the sea was beginning, just beginning, to do something he did not have a word for. The water was rising in slow domes, here and there across the surface, as if something very large beneath was breathing. The air smelled of metal and ozone. The stars above the place where he was going were dim, as if seen through smoke, though there was no smoke. He set the long fuse on the acetylene, first the one Lou had built him, the slow one, then the shorter fuse on the ammonium nitrate barrels in the hold. Then he sat down on the deck with his back against the cabin, and he waited until the GPS said kilometer, and he hummed his mother's old Portuguese fishing song all the way through, because he had not, in a long time, sung it all the way through. At 1 kilometer he stood up and walked to the stern and looked one time, only one time, back toward the east, where there was nothing to see but dark water and the faint suggestion of a horizon that did not yet know what was about to happen on it. Then he turned and he looked forward at the rising domes of water and the dim stars, and he said out loud to no one and everything, all right. He did not jump. He sat back down on the deck with his back against the cabin. He took the medallion of Santo Antonio he had kept. The duplicate, the small wooden one, Tio Rui had pressed into his hand the second time, when he had thought no one was looking, and he closed his fist around it. He had promised on the silver one. The silver one was around Kim's neck. He had not promised on the wood. He was a diesel mechanic, and he understood the difference between a strong weld and a weak one. And he understood also that an autopilot in heavy swell could fail, and a fuse in salt spray could fail, and a man who had jumped off a boat at 1 kilometer might watch that boat veer off course in the last 100 meters and detonate over empty water, and he would not survive that knowledge. He would not survive it. The Maria Luz, fat and humming, went into the place where the water was rising in slow domes, and Evan Hark, diesel mechanic, son of a woman who had sung him an old fishing song in the kitchen of a house in Watsonville, lover of a marine biologist who would have to forgive him, kept his hand on the wheel for the last 100 meters, and he straightened the boat, and he aimed her at the largest of the domes. And he's quietly, in the only prayer he had ever really believed, please. The explosion was visible from the cliffs above Santa Cruz. It was visible from the deck of a Coast Guard cutter 80 miles offshore that had been ordered 3 days earlier to maintain a perimeter and report. It was visible from a Japanese fishing trawler on the far side of the strike zone. It was visible from low orbit, where two satellites that had been built to look for missile launches recorded it and flagged it and sent it up the chain of command, where men in basements would, in the coming weeks, watch the footage, frame by frame, and try to understand what had been done and how. What had been done was this. A 38-foot wooden fishing boat called the Maria Luz, captained at the end by one man, had detonated in the precise center of a gathered swarm of an extraterrestrial species in the moment of its final coordination, and the detonation had not killed all of them, because nothing kills all of them, but it had killed enough. It had killed the central singers of the song Kim Aiyama had been listening to on her hydrophone. It had broken the count, the signal she heard, with her headphones pressed to her ears. In the small skiff a kilometer east did not stop. But it changed. It became confused. It became, after a long minute, frightened. And then, over the next 40 minutes, as she sat in the skiff, with Lou's hand on her shoulder and her face perfectly still, it became, in some way she could feel but never afterward describe, lonely. The main body did not come ashore. 2 days later, the swarms that had been patrolling the California coast began, in ones and twos, and then in larger groups, to fly west, out over the Pacific, and to drop down into the water, and not to come back up. By the end of the week, the sky of Sanitak Cruz was empty for the first time in a month. By the end of the second week, the sky was full of gulls again, ordinary gulls, white and stupid and screaming, and a woman in a wetsuit walked down to a creek behind a winery in the hills above Soquel, and she dropped a hydrophone into the water, and she listened for a long time, and she heard nothing at all. She sat down on the bank with the headphones around her neck. She put her hand inside her shirt and closed it around a small, worn silver medallion that had belonged to an old Azorean woman she had never met. After a while, a child of about 8 came down through the willows and sat down beside her and did not speak, and put her small hand on the woman's wrist, and the two of them sat there together, looking at the water, for a long time. That winter, Tio Rui carved a name into the trunk of the lemon tree in the winery's garden, next to the place where they had buried what was left of Caesar. He carved it slowly, with a pocket knife, in the way of a man for whom carving was a kind of prayer. He carved Maria Luz and under it Evan Hark, and under that in his own language, Era bombhoming il concerto a motor. He was a good man, he fixed the engine. In the spring, Kim Oyama walked down to the harbor for the first time since the end. She walked alone, in the early morning, with her hands in the pockets of her jacket. She walked out to the end of the breakwater, and stood there and looked west. The flat, empty Pacific that had given up, finally, the thing it had been holding. She did not cry. She had not cried much in the winter. She had been very busy. There had been a great deal of work to do. She took the medallion from around her neck. She held it in her palm for a moment. Then she closed her fingers around it again and put it back, because, she thought, the dead do not need silver, and she was not done with it yet. She said, out loud to the water, "All right, Evan Hark." She walked back up the breakwater. The sun was just coming over the hills behind her, and her shadow went out long and thin across the rocks ahead, and somewhere very far off, a gull was screaming, and the world, which had ended, beginning, slowly and badly and stubbornly, in the way of human things, to start again. That, she thought, would have to be enough. For now, it was enough.